What you're about to hear is one of the most unsettling moments to unfold in a congressional hearing this year, a moment where Representative Madeleine didn't just question an FBI director, she issued a warning about how fast a democracy can shift when power and law enforcement collide. And the reason this moment hit so hard is because she wasn't talking about a hypothetical fear or a political talking point. She was talking about something unfolding right in front of her. A book, a list, a so-called roadmap.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Meng, Chairman Cole, Ranking Member DeLauro. And thank you, Mr. Patel, for your testimony and for being here today. I've been looking at the President's 120-word FBI budget request, the so-called skinny, I'll call it Ozempic request, that states that, quote, the undoing of the weaponization of the FBI is one of the administration's top priorities. The weaponization of the FBI is something that deeply concerns me. It should concern all of us. And yet, since taking office, President Trump has been on a revenge tour. He has targeted individuals, universities, law firms, with executive orders to cut them out or to make them come under his will. He has used ICE to disappear U.S. citizens without due process, and he's fully ignored a unanimous Supreme Court order, and then over the weekend wasn't sure if he was obligated to uphold the Constitution of the United States. In your book, your recent book, Government Gangsters, you include an appendix with a list of names that people have referred to as an enemies list. Now, I know you will claim it's just an appendix, not an enemies list. So let's focus on how the president sees it, on what the president calls it. And you proudly display his quote on the front cover of your book. The president calls this a brilliant roadmap, a blueprint. And I have not even raised your storied children's book, The Plot Against the King. It concerns me how many people from this blueprint have been targeted with executive orders and FBI investigations. The FBI cannot be weaponized, and under your leadership, it has been nothing but a weapon alongside the president to go after the president's perceived opponents, to stifle dissent and free speech. A few weeks ago, as we saw through a social media post that you quickly deleted, the FBI arrested a judge in Wisconsin for correctly asking ICE officials if they had a judicial warrant instead of an administrative warrant, which they did not have. Despite this judge following the law, on the morning of April the 25th, the FBI arrested the judge in an escalation of the weaponization of the FBI under your leadership. Let me be clear. A functioning democracy does not lock up judges. I am gravely concerned about the utter lack of independence of the FBI and its weaponization under your leadership. I am concerned that the president is using this book, your book, as a blueprint, as he has said. It's a blueprint for revenge. And I am concerned that your eagerness, a childlike giddiness to carry out the president's revenge tour, you've shown yourself to be unserious in your statements before you were sworn in and some after. You've shown yourself unfit to lead this important agency. I was an impeachment manager for President Trump's second impeachment. It was a sad, solemn duty. And so I wanted to ask you about that. Mr. Patel, as you and the president continue to weaponize and investigate his perceived enemies, as you follow this blueprint, when can I, a former impeachment manager, expect the FBI at my door?
Ma'am, you want to know who was targeted by a weaponized FBI? Me. You want to know how and why?
Well,
you want to know what I'm doing to fix it?
Let me move on.
Well, you should read the book because there's no enemies
So-
list on that book.
So
There are
you-
people that violated their constitutional obligations and their duties to the American people.
That's good. You
And they
gave
were
them due
rightly
process.
called out.
I'm
And you
changing
should
topics.
give that book to every one of your
I'm
constituents so they can
changing
read
topics.
about it.
I won't be doing that.
That's their loss.
During your Senate confirmation hearings, you repeatedly denied having any involvement as a private citizen in the firing of FBI officials who engaged in the prosecution against January 6 insurrectionists, the violent rioters who beat and killed Capitol police officers, and whom you referred to as political prisoners. Since then, multiple whistleblowers have come forward, and we know that you likely committed perjury. At the same hearing, You claimed you were not familiar with Stu Peters, an anti-Semitic Holocaust denier, despite the fact that you appeared on Mr. Peters' podcast 8 separate times. 8 times, and you claimed not to recall. Mr. Patel, my second question is, should we worry more about your memory or your veracity?
We should worry more about your lack of candor. You're accusing me of committing
Veracity?
perjury. Tell the American
You didn't
people how
know.
I broke the law and committed a felony.
You did
Have the audacity to actually put the
all right,
facts
then
forward
the answer is
instead of
both.
lying for political banter so you can have a 20-second
answer
donation hit.
The answer is both. I believe that the
The
men and
answer is
women of
you're
the
failing, not
I
me.
reclaim my time.
Go ahead.
Mr. Patel, I believe that the members of the FBI, and I know many of them, many retired, 38,000 people, as you say, it's a little less than that now, deserve the very best, deserve extraordinary independence, deserve freedom from the fears of being investigated, the freedom of coming forward to make sure they're doing their job. And I'll end with this, that I think it's interesting that in your proposal today, you find yourself at a gulf of difference between you and the president. I wonder how you will resolve that. Will you go to the president and say, we need $11.2 billion, not what you cut out of here? You're asking for more than $1 billion than the president's request. Are you going to go to the president and straighten out that gulf?
I'll do what I've always done and represent the American people, defend this country, and make sure the Constitution is always upheld and the FBI is never weaponized. Maybe you should do the same.
So you agree with the president when he says he doesn't know if he should uphold his constitutional duty?
If you want to just keep putting words in my mouth, the TV cameras are outside.
I thank you. I yield back. Again, this is an unserious moment, sadly, for the FBI. I yield back.
More so for you.
Mr. Strong.
And a man leading the nation's most powerful investigative agency who didn't seem bothered at all by what that roadmap might mean. This wasn't just tension, it was a flashing red signal that something deeper is happening behind the scenes. Something that, if left unchallenged, could reshape the expectations citizens have about their own government. That's why the room fell silent when she said the next part. Dean looked directly at Kash Patel and said, what actually happens when the man running the FBI publishes a blueprint of perceived enemies and the president calls it a roadmap for revenge? And just like that, the tone shifted. You could feel it. The entire hearing went from routine oversight to a test of whether independent law enforcement still exists in the United States. The question wasn't angry, it wasn't theatrical, it was fearful. And the way Patel responded only raised more alarms. But that wasn't even the most critical part. Because the real story here isn't just a heated exchange, it's the pattern Dean laid out, a pattern that suggests law enforcement may be drifting away from independence and toward political loyalty. And the next minute of this confrontation made that shift impossible to ignore. Dean didn't just criticize the list in Patel's book, she explained why it mattered. The appendix contains names of individuals critics have called an enemies list. Patel has repeatedly insisted it's not that, but the president has called the book a brilliant roadmap, a blueprint, and Patel proudly placed that endorsement on the cover. That alone would be concerning. But Dean pointed to something more important, the number of people named in that blueprint who later found themselves under executive pressure or within the scope of federal investigations. Rumors online have suggested this list became a quiet reference point inside the administration, a place where perceived disloyalty was catalogued. Whether that's fully accurate or not, the appearance of retaliation is enough to undermine trust. Because in a functioning democracy, law enforcement leaders do everything in their power to avoid even the slightest hint of political targeting. Here, Dean argued, the hint wasn't subtle, it was printed on the front cover of a book. But it wasn't just the book that worried her. She laid out what she described as a broader pattern, a pattern that shows the administration claiming to unwind weaponization while allegedly expanding it behind the scenes. She cited executive orders targeting universities, law firms, and individuals who publicly opposed key policies. She highlighted cases where immigration enforcement was used in ways she described as sidestepping due process affecting even U.S. citizens. and she pointed to official documents stating that one of the administration's top priorities is the undoing of weaponization within the FBI. Yet the actions she described seemed to suggest the opposite: a steady increase in power, a willingness to pressure institutions, a tendency to pursue critics aggressively. She warned that if rhetoric and reality drift too far apart, the public loses the ability to trust anything the government claims about fairness. But the most troubling example was still to come, because then she raised the one incident that shook the room. A story that spread across legal circles and judicial groups nationwide: the arrest of a judge in Wisconsin. According to Dean, this judge did nothing more than what the law required, asking federal officers whether they had a valid judicial warrant rather than an administrative one. That is normal. That is standard. That is how judges ensure rights are protected. But on the morning of April 25, the FBI arrested that judge. Dean described this as a dangerous escalation, the kind of moment that begins to stretch the limits of democratic norms. Analysts online have warned that if judges fear retaliation for enforcing basic legal procedure, the entire justice system starts to warp. And Dean spelled out exactly how that warp happens. Prosecutors stop making tough calls. Agents hesitate before following proper process. Whistleblowers stay quiet. Because once fear enters the system, integrity starts to vanish. And when she raised that point, the hearing shifted again. Suddenly this wasn't about personalities. It was about institutions and whether they were being reshaped to reward loyalty rather than law. But Dean wasn't done. Her next question became the viral moment of the entire exchange. She looked Patel in the eye and asked, "As a former impeachment manager, when should I expect the FBI at my door?" It was a simple question, but a devastating one. And it wasn't about her at all. It was about the thousands of Americans who quietly wonder the same thing, not because they've done anything wrong, but because dissent itself feels riskier now. In strong democracies, disagreement is protected speech. In fragile ones, it becomes a liability. And her question captured that shift perfectly. Patel's response didn't calm the room. He didn't affirm that law enforcement must remain independent. He didn't emphasize boundaries that must never be crossed. Instead, he focused on himself, describing how he believed he had been targeted in the past, and accusing Dean of lacking candor. It was defensive, emotional, and for many watching, it didn't reassure them that the FBI would avoid political retaliation in the future. And from that moment on, the tone of the hearing never recovered. Dean then moved to concerns about Patel's credibility, raising statements from his Senate confirmation hearing that she said appeared inconsistent with later evidence. She pointed to testimony where he denied involvement in personnel decisions related to investigations following the January 6 attack. She noted whistleblowers who have since come forward suggesting otherwise. She highlighted his claim that he didn't know a controversial media figure he had actually appeared with multiple times. She said these contradictions raised a serious question: should the public worry more about Patel's memory or his honesty? Patel fired back, accusing her of lying for political gain. But the exchange didn't address the underlying issue, whether transparency and truthfulness were guiding principles for someone leading the nation's most powerful investigative agency. And this was precisely the point Dean was making. Once leadership becomes entangled in political narratives, the line between oversight and hostility, between accountability and resentment, becomes dangerously thin. What made her warning so compelling wasn't the volume of her voice, it was the clarity of the danger she described. A book naming individuals as constitutional violators, a president praising it as a blueprint, executive actions against perceived critics, the arrest of a judge for following the law, investigations involving individuals mentioned in that appendix, a growing gap between public messages about undoing weaponization and private actions that suggest consolidation of authority. Public commentators have noted that no democracy loses its independence overnight. It happens slowly, often quietly, through normalization and fatigue, through small shifts that don't feel alarming until the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. And Dean's testimony attempted to place every one of those shifts side by side, to show viewers the full picture rather than isolated moments. Because once law enforcement begins to blur the line between serving the public and serving political power, it rarely stops with the first list of names. She closed by reminding the hearing that the FBI's independence is not a procedural preference, it is the anchor of public trust. The agency's agents, analysts and staff cannot do their jobs effectively if they fear retaliation for making lawful necessary decisions. They cannot investigate wrongdoing if they worry that the wrong target might anger the administration. And they cannot maintain morale if leadership seems aligned with political grudges. She argued that the FBI deserves a director who prioritizes integrity over loyalty, boundaries over applause, and independence over personal narratives. Patel insisted he would defend the Constitution and represent the American people, but Dean countered that his statements, actions and publications painted a very different picture, one where revenge not restraint seemed to guide the strategy. And in that moment both sides drew a line in the sand, a line that will shape public trust long after this hearing fades. The real question now isn't whether this confrontation was heated. It's whether the concerns Dean raised signal something larger, a shift in how power is being used, how institutions are being guided, and how dissent is being treated. Because if law enforcement becomes an instrument for political aims, history has shown that it never ends with the first perceived opponent. The list grows. The definition of dissent expands, and ordinary citizens begin to wonder if their rights depend on their silence. That is why this hearing matters. That is why her questions resonate far beyond the walls of Congress, and that is why understanding moments like this is essential, because democratic erosion doesn't begin loudly. It begins quietly, through warnings like the one you just heard, warnings that only matter if the public refuses to look away. If you found this breakdown helpful and want to stay ahead of stories shaping power, law, and accountability, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next deep dive. Your engagement helps bring these important conversations to more viewers. Thanks for watching and stay informed.